It was in a chilling cold night while returning from their late night walk that Sherlock and Watson received a client waiting in front of their room. It was a well-known doctor in the city by the name of Percy Trevelyan. He had come for Sherlock's advice regarding an issue that bothered his landlord, who was also his employer by the name of Blessington. Blessington had approached Percy years back once he passed out of medical school. He offered Percy a place to stay and an office room to conduct his practice. All Blessington asked in return was a portion of the earnings from the practice. Although Percy had a medical degree, his pockets were empty and the offer from Blessington seemed too good to turn down. So he accepted the terms and moved in. The day before, Percy received a visit from a cataleptic patient. He was an elderly Russian man who was accompanied by his son. Catalepsy is a disease that affects muscle rigidity and restricts movement of limbs. The son helped his father into the doctor's room and proceeded to wait outside before the consultation began. Halfway through the consultation, Percy went outside to get a medicine for the patient which he had kept in his laboratory. But once he returned, the consultation room was empty, and there was no sign of his patient nor his son, who was supposedly waiting outside. Percy then proceeded to question his assistant, but he also had no idea where they had gone. They then returned this day morning. The patient told that he had forgotten where he was and got out of the place in confusion. And the son followed him, thinking that the consultation was over. Percy understood the situation, as such moments of memory loss are common among cataleptic patients. He then proceeded to continue the consultation while the son waited outside. Once the consultation finished, the father-son duo left the place immediately. A few minutes after they left, Mr. Blessington stormed into Percy's room and started to question him. He asked whether Percy or his assistant had entered his room upstairs. He had gone out for a walk and had just returned. Percy was confused and had no idea of what had happened. Blessington and Percy then proceeded to the room upstairs. On entering, it was evident that someone had actually broken in. There were footprints of the intruder on the floor. The father-son duo were the only people who entered the building while Blessington was out on his evening walk. Blessington acted scared and fearful from that point onwards. He then asked Percy to consult Sherlock just to get an idea of what might have happened in the room. Sherlock, intrigued by the story, accepted the case. He went along with Percy to the crime site. Watson also joined him. Once they reached the location, they were welcomed by a frantic and tensed Blessington. Sherlock entered the room for his preliminary examination. He then asked Blessington whether he knew the two Russian men who came to see Percy. Blessington gave a vague reply and proceeded to show Sherlock around the room. He then pointed to a box in the shelf and told that all of his savings are kept in that box, and whoever the intruder was should have come for that box. Sherlock checked the box and saw that it has not been tampered with, nor any of the valuables in the room were missing. He immediately understood that Blessington was bluffing, and that he indeed knew the two men who came to see Percy. He then refused to give any advice until Blessington told the truth. But Blessington was adamant and was not ready to comply. So Sherlock had to drop the case and went back along with Watson. On the way back, Sherlock told to Watson that Blessington knew who the two men were, and the man who was waiting outside the consultation room was the one who entered Blessington's room, and the patient who had come for the consultation was merely acting to be cataleptic. The very next morning, Sherlock once again got a visit from Percy. This time, he had come with a very tragic news that Blessington had committed suicide. He had hung himself during the night. Shocked, Sherlock and Watson immediately followed him to the location. By the time they reached there, the police, led by Inspector Lana, were already examining the room. Lana had already concluded that the cause of the death was suicide, but Sherlock thought otherwise. He immediately knew that it was murder. He conveyed his thoughts to the inspector and the others. He found 4 cigar ends that were thrown into the fireplace. He then concluded that the 2 men who had come for the consultation were involved in the murder. They were also accompanied by a 3rd individual. He also told that Percy's assistant was also involved, probably indirectly. He has been missing since yesterday. Sherlock then promised to give a thorough explanation by afternoon and proceeded to exit the room along with Watson. Before leaving, he took a photograph of Blessington, which was kept in the shelf. By afternoon, all of them gathered at the crime site, and Sherlock was ready with his answer. He told that the identities of the 3 men have been found. He told that he had visited the police headquarters, and using the photograph that he had taken from the shelf, he was able to identify that Blessington's real name was Sutton. And the other 3 men were possibly Biddle, Hayward, and Moffat. They were the Worthington bank robbery gang who were captured and convicted 15 years ago. The 4 men were accompanied by a 5th man by the name of Cartwright. Together, they murdered the caretaker of the bank vault and stole the money. A few days later, Sutton, who is now Blessington, turned in on his comrades by informing the police. For being the informant, he was exempted from the conviction and was presented in court as a witness. During the trial, Cartwright was sentenced to death for the murder of the caretaker, and the other 3 men were sentenced to 15 years in prison. They were released only a few weeks ago, and immediately they sought out to find Sutton in order to take revenge and avenge the death of Cartwright. They found Sutton's location and bribed Percy's assistant in order to gain access to his room. During the night, they entered Sutton's room again and immediately silenced him. He was then hung using the hook on the ceiling. Having finished their work, they made off. Percy's assistant was arrested later that day. As of the 3 murderers, no trace of them have been found since then.